Millions watched as it unfolded live. She mocked him on air, confident in her studio chair. But he didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself with anger. What he said instead silenced the room and then the world. Within hours, his quiet dignity turned into a global reckoning. The reporter's smirk faded. Her regret? It echoed across continents. September 15th had begun like any ordinary morning at CNN headquarters in Atlanta. Sunlight glinted off the network's glass towers, and inside, producers raced through their routines, finalizing scripts, adjusting lighting, juggling egos. But no one in that building had the faintest idea that by nightfall, one interview would consume the internet, dominate headlines, and force the world to confront the uneasy marriage of power, prejudice, and grace. President Ibrahim Traoré had touched down in New York 3 days earlier for the United Nations General Assembly. At just 35, he was one of Africa's youngest presidents, elected after a sweeping revolution in Burkina Faso, a movement that had upended colonial legacies and rattled foreign powers. The Western media couldn't look away. Here was a young military captain who had ousted French forces, spoken unapologetically of African pride, and moved like a man unafraid of history's judgment. CNN's invitation came through formal channels, a coveted slot on Global Perspective, hosted by the well-known anchor Kaitlyn Monroe. The opportunity was massive, a rare chance to shape global perception. Inside Troy's team, the debate was fierce. Some feared a trap, questions designed to make him look unstable, volatile, extreme. Others believed it was too important to ignore. Ultimately, Troy decided himself, as he always did. "We'll go," he said, "not to seek their permission, but because the world deserves to hear our story." The green room at CNN was sterile, dressed in calming shades of beige and gray. Troy sat quietly in the leather chair, his brown jacket carrying the warm fuse of his homeland. No medals, no theatrics, just calm presence. A young production assistant approached, clearly nervous. "President Troy, would you like anything? Coffee? Water? We've got pastries too." "Just water," he said gently. His English was deliberate, accented, part French, part Duella, all his own. The voice of a man who had mastered others' languages without losing his own soul. The assistant returned with a glass and hesitated. Then she spoke. "My family's from Ghana. We've been following your work. My grandmother says you remind her of the leaders she grew up admiring." A rare smile crossed Troy's face. "Tell her the fight isn't over, and that we carry her generation's courage with us." She left, and he returned to stillness. Through the glass, the newsroom buzzed with its usual chaos. Deadlines, sound bites, ratings. It was a machine built for noise. He wondered if there was still space in this world for truths that took time. His mind drifted to his village, Bondi. His mother had taught children in a school without electricity. His father repaired bicycles with scraps. Wisdom in that world came slowly, earned through listening and silence. His grandmother had been a griot, a guardian of stories. She had warned him, "The ancestors are listening. Every word you speak will either honor them or betray them." He carried those words through military school, through battles, through a revolution. And now, in this colorless studio, they echoed louder than ever. A knock at the door pulled him back. The assistant returned, this time with a sharply dressed man. "President Troy, this is James Mitchell, our senior producer." Mitchell offered a rehearsed smile and a firm handshake. "Mr. President, we're honored to have you. Just wanted to run through the format." Troy nodded. "Please." "Our viewers don't know much about West Africa, so Kaitlyn will focus on the broader issues, your France relations, the economy, your goals for the region. Some questions might be tough, but it's never personal." I met his eyes. "I didn't come to be comfortable. I came to speak truth." Mitchell gave a tight grin. "Good. Just remember, it's TV. Keep your answers short, impactful. And don't worry about the accent. Adds authenticity." The comment hung in the air, well-meaning perhaps, but revealing more than intended. Neither man addressed it. Mitchell nodded and left. And Troy? He sat alone once more, poised, still, ready to speak, not for applause, but for history. 15 minutes later, another knock. This time, it was Kaitlyn Monroe herself, flanked by a sleek entourage of assistants. She entered the room with the commanding air of someone used to power, fame, and being listened to. Her blonde hair was immaculately styled. Her navy blue suit fitted like armor, every detail of her appearance curated to project control. She was the face of elite American media, polished, composed, and certain of her place in the global hierarchy. "President Troy," she said, offering a perfectly manicured hand. "Such a pleasure. I'm Kaitlyn Monroe. I've been looking forward to our conversation." "The pleasure is mine," Troy replied, rising to greet her. In contrast to her flawless presentation, his brown jacket seemed humble, almost rustic. Yet it carried a quiet dignity, the kind that didn't need tailoring to be seen. "I hope you're comfortable," she said, her smile camera-ready but hollow. "This should be a fascinating discussion. Your story, from soldier to revolutionary, is quite dramatic." The word hung in the air. Dramatic. She said it like she was describing a character arc in a documentary, as if he were a plotline, not a head of state. Troy heard it, understood it, but chose silence. "I've read your bio," he said instead. "Rhodes Scholar at Columbia University, 5 Emmys. Impressive work in your field." Her smile deepened. "Thank you. I've always believed journalism should inform, challenge, and illuminate. That's our goal tonight." An assistant leaned in to whisper something. She nodded, then turned back to Troy. "Time to head to makeup. We go live in 20 minutes." As they walked the corridor toward the studio, Troy passed through the nerve center of American news. Banks of screens flashing global headlines, editors trimming clips, fact-checkers racing against the clock. It was vast, precise, and strangely impersonal. All this machinery, yet somehow detached from the people whose stories it claimed to tell. In the makeup chair, a gentle voice broke the tension. "You have great skin," said Rosa, the makeup artist. "Just a little powder for the lights. Nervous?" "No," Troy answered truthfully. He had negotiated ceasefires, faced armed insurgents, made life-or-death calls in the dark. A televised interview was a conversation, nothing more. "You're calm. That's rare," Rosa said, dabbing gently. "Most politicians walk in sweating bullets. You feel peaceful." "My grandmother said, 'If you speak truth, you need not fear,'" Troy replied. Rosa smiled. She must have been wise. She also said, "Dignity isn't something that can be taken, only something we give away." Rosa paused. Then, "Hold on to yours. Not many do." As she finished, Troy closed his eyes briefly and centered himself. He thought of the farmers back home, the nurses, the students, the elders who'd believed in the revolution. He thought of the roads they'd paved, the clinics they opened, the schools that lit up now at night. He thought of the foreign officials who warned him against radical reforms, of the diplomats who whispered caution, of the skeptics watching with folded arms. But he wasn't here for them. He was here for the truth. The studio was smaller than expected, but the lights were scorching, and the cameras loomed like sentinels. Kaitlyn was already in her chair, scanning her notes. She looked up as he entered and offered another tight-lipped smile. "Ready for this?" "I am always ready to speak for my people," Traoré said, taking his seat. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. The room narrowed to a point of heat and focus. 3, 2, 1. "Good evening, and welcome to Global Perspectives," Kaitlyn said smoothly. "I'm Kaitlyn Monroe. Tonight we're joined by President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, one of Africa's youngest and most controversial leaders. President Traoré, thank you for being here." "Thank you for having me," he replied calmly, his voice steady beneath the studio lights. "It is an honor to speak where your people listen." His accent was distinct, not easily categorized, the cadence of a man who had learned English out of necessity, not privilege, but made it his own. French undertones, yes, but also the rhythm of Douala, the voice of someone shaped by more than one world. Kaitlyn's practiced smile flickered, just slightly. She pressed on. "Well, surely you understand the concerns of your international partners. The French military presence was there to help maintain regional stability, to fight terrorism. Without that support, aren't you worried about the safety of your people?" Traoré leaned in ever so slightly. "Madame Monroe," he said with quiet strength, "you speak of stability as though it is something that can be delivered from the sky. But real stability, true stability, does not arrive in uniform. It grows from within. It comes from a people who feel ownership of their land, who believe their voices matter, and who know that their leaders answer to them, not to distant capitals." His words were deliberate, his tone calm, but each syllable was precise, sharpened by years of having to make himself understood in a world that mistook accent for ignorance. Kaitlyn pressed on, her voice tightening. "Your economic decisions have raised eyebrows as well. Nationalizing gold mines, pushing for regional currencies, limiting foreign investment. Some call those moves naive, fairy tale economics even. Do you really believe Burkina Faso can thrive while rejecting the international system?" Traoré didn't flinch, but something flickered in his eyes, a flash of quiet weariness. He'd heard this tone before, 1,000 times. The condescension masked as concern, the certainty of those who had never set foot on his soil. "Burkina Faso has never been alone," he said slowly. "We were simply taught not to see ourselves." It was the kind of line that didn't just answer a question, it reframed the entire conversation. And then she laughed. Not cruelly, not loudly, but audibly. A light, amused chuckle, more instinct than intention. The kind of laugh someone lets slip when they think something is quaint, or cute, or beneath them. And it echoed. Through the studio, through the control room, through every headset. Everyone froze. It wasn't the sound itself, it was the timing, the context, the way it landed. Like mockery. As if the gravity of what Traoré had said was somehow amusing. "Forgive me," Kaitlyn said quickly, still smiling though her eyes betrayed the sudden shift in atmosphere. "It's just the phrasing, with your accent. It's rather charming." The word hung there, heavy, final. Charming. As if he were a performer, as if centuries of struggle could be reduced to something endearing. But Traoré didn't react. He didn't frown, he didn't flinch, he didn't speak. He simply looked at her, calm, still, unshaken. And the silence that followed was immense, the kind that makes even seasoned producers forget to breathe, the kind of silence that doesn't demand attention, it commands it. Then he spoke, not louder, not sharper, just deeper. I have spoken French to be accepted, English to be understood, but when I speak truth, it is my accent that offends. The words dropped into the air like a stone into still water, ripples spreading outward. Kaitlyn's smile cracked. Her poise faltered. For a moment, she looked like someone seeing their reflection clearly for the first time and not liking what they saw. But Troy wasn't finished. He continued, "You laugh at my words because they come wrapped in a voice you do not expect power to wear. But remember, strong winds do not come from polished mouths, but from honest lungs." It was poetry. It was precision. It was centuries of resistance compressed into a single breath. For 12 full seconds, no one moved. The cameras kept rolling. The director stayed frozen. The control room sat in stunned silence. Kaitlyn tried to recover. "I didn't mean to—" Troy raised his hand gently, and the rest of her sentence died in her throat. "I have given you a gift," he said. "You've shown the world what we are truly fighting. Not weapons, not economics, but the belief that dignity belongs only to those who speak in certain tones." The rest of the interview continued, technically. More questions were asked, more answers given, but none of it mattered. The moment had already happened, and nothing that followed could match it. When the cameras finally cut and the lights dimmed, Kaitlyn sat motionless in her chair, shell-shocked. She had interviewed prime ministers, presidents, war criminals, whistleblowers, but she had never been dismantled, not by rage, not by rhetoric, but by dignity. Troy stood, smoothed his jacket, and prepared to leave. As he passed her, he paused, just long enough to speak softly, so only she could hear. "I don't think you're a bad person, Ms. Monroe. I think you've simply forgotten respect is not something you grant, it's something you recognize." And with that, he walked out. Behind her, the studio remained suspended in silence. Within hours, the clip was everywhere, across phones, news feeds, television screens. It wasn't just an interview, it was a reckoning, a reminder, a line drawn in the sand between power that is performed and power that is earned. It wasn't the full interview that went viral, just that one moment. The laugh, the question, the reply, and it spread like wildfire. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. Every platform lit up, flooded with commentary, analysis, outrage, and admiration. Hashtags took off within minutes. Hashtag AccentGate. Hashtag Tao teaches class. Hashtag dignity. Hashtag cancel Kaitlyn. The reaction was swift and global. Academics called it a masterclass in grace under pressure. Activists called it a mirror to the media's unconscious prejudice. Ordinary people shared their own stories, times when they were mocked for how they spoke, told they sounded funny, made to feel small for the way their voice landed in a foreign world. But the most powerful response came from young people, especially across Africa and the diaspora. Videos began surfacing from university dorms in Lagos to classrooms in Detroit. Students recited President Troy's words like scripture. "The strongest winds do not come from polished mouths, but from honest lungs." The phrase became a movement, a mantra. proof that truth didn't need refinement, just courage. That night, in her hotel room high above Midtown Manhattan, Kaitlyn Monroe couldn't sleep. She sat alone in the dark, laptop open, scrolling. Tweets, comments, headlines, reactions, think pieces from every corner of the world dissecting what had happened in Studio 4B. The criticism was brutal, but not unjust. She had made a mistake, a costly one, and she was beginning to realize just how deep the damage ran. Her phone buzzed. Again. Text from her publicist. "We need to talk at 8 a.m. sharp." One from her agent. "The network's worried. Emergency meeting." But it was the email from her daughter that stopped her cold. Sophie, a sophomore at Harvard studying international relations, had watched the interview with her friends in the dorm lounge. "Mom, I love you, but I was embarrassed tonight. My friends were all talking about the interview, and I didn't know what to say. You always taught me to treat people with respect, no matter how they look or sound. What happened?" Kaitlyn stared at the screen, silent, stung. She had made a mistake, a costly one, and she was beginning to realize just how deep the damage ran. She thought about her own family, about her grandmother's thick Irish brogue, the way people used to mock her, the shame that clung to her accent in 1960s Boston. She remembered how hard her parents worked to fit in, to sound American, to lose what made them different. And now, decades later, had she become one of those people? Had success turned her into the very thing her family had once struggled against? By morning, the headlines were everywhere. BBC, Dignity Moment, African President Silences Bias on Live TV. Al Jazeera, Accent Bias and the Western Media Machine. The New York Times, The Sound of Respect, What Ibrahim Traoré Taught the World. CNN's leadership was in chaos. The phone lines rang nonstop. Concerned advertisers, agitated affiliates, furious viewers. Editorial teams scrambled to control the narrative. In the 8th floor conference room, Kaitlyn sat across from a circle of senior executives. Margaret Chen, the network president, didn't waste time. "The clip has passed 10 million views in under 24 hours. This is serious, and it's not fading." "I made a mistake," Kaitlyn said plainly, "a big one. I reacted without thinking, and I hurt someone who deserved better." The head of PR leaned forward. "We can put out a written apology, you go on air, maybe host a panel on representation and bias, bring in some experts. We manage the fallout." But Kaitlyn shook her head. "This isn't about management. This is about accountability. I didn't just make a PR error. I violated something deeper, and I need to make it right." Over the next 72 hours, the story continued to dominate news cycles. Editorials flooded in. Professors assigned the interview as a case study in cultural power dynamics. The United Nations released a statement calling for more respectful dialogue between global leaders and the media. But the moment that shifted the ground beneath CNN came from a group of students. Columbia University, Kaitlyn's alma mater. They organized a silent protest outside the network's headquarters. Students of every background stood shoulder to shoulder, holding hand-lettered signs. "The strongest wins do not come from polished mouths. Dignity is not something you lose, only something you give away. When I speak truth, it is my accent that offends." Images of the protest swept across the internet, almost as powerful as the original clip itself. It wasn't just a reaction, it was a movement. On the third day, Kaitlyn made her decision. No statement, no PR tour. She would return to the same chair where it happened, alone, and speak from the heart. The studio was unchanged, but the energy was different. No spotlight, no show, just a reckoning. She sat at the anchor desk, no guest, no co-host, no filter. She had written and rewritten her remarks a dozen times, but when the light came on, she looked straight into the camera and left the paper untouched. "Good evening," she began, her voice quieter than usual. And for once, the world leaned in. 3 days ago, I sat across from President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso for what was meant to be a meaningful, global conversation. Instead, I failed. I failed in the most basic responsibility any journalist holds, to treat every guest with the respect and dignity they deserve, not as a courtesy, but as a right. My words are simple tonight, and they carry only one message. I am sorry. I want to offer a direct apology to President Traoré, to the people of Burkina Faso, and to every person who has ever been made to feel small because of how they speak. I laughed at his accent. I called it charming. And in doing so, I exposed a bias I didn't even know I carried. She paused, visibly shaken, gathering herself. I have spent decades interviewing leaders, scientists, poets, survivors. I believed I was fair. I believed I was thoughtful. But President Traoré's quiet dignity forced me to confront something I've long avoided. That privilege can blind you, that success can make you deaf to your own prejudices, that we don't always see the harm we cause, even when it happens live on camera. The camera stayed close, tight on her expression, showing vulnerability instead of polish. He said something that I will never forget. The strongest wins do not come from polished mouths, but from honest lungs. I built my entire career on having a polished mouth, on speaking smoothly, confidently, authoritatively. But in that moment, I realized that polish means nothing without humility, that authority is empty without respect. She looked into the lens, no longer as an anchor, but as a person. I'm taking a leave of absence from CNN, not to escape criticism, but to reflect, to listen, to unlearn, and to do the real work required to ensure I never repeat this mistake. I will be traveling to Burkina Faso, not for a segment, not for ratings, but to offer my apology in person, to learn from the people whose voices I dismissed with a careless smile, to understand the culture I reduced to a soundbite. The announcement took even CNN's management by surprise, but it landed with power. Some moments demand more than a statement. Some mistakes require more than words. To anyone who has ever been mocked for their accent, to everyone who has ever been told their voice wasn't good enough, wasn't neutral enough, wasn't professional enough, I see you, and I am sorry. You deserve better from me, and from all of us in the media, who are entrusted to tell your stories. The broadcast ended quietly. No music, no graphics, just silence and reflection. But the world responded quickly. Within hours, hashtags trended globally. Hashtag Kitty Apology. Hashtag Troy Teaches Dignity. Hashtag Respect Matters. Some praised her courage. Others said it was too little, too late. But one thing was undeniable. The conversation had shifted. The dialogue about voice, power, and respect had no longer been confined to the media. It had become personal, urgent, and everywhere. 2 weeks later, Kaitlyn Monroe stepped off a plane in Ouagadougou. She had never been to West Africa before. The red dust coated her shoes, the air buzzed with the sound of motorbikes, and the scent of grilled meat Charcoal and earth filled her lungs. She was accompanied by a small crew. But this wasn't a broadcast assignment. It was something else. A reckoning. A step towards understanding. The meeting with President Traoré was arranged quietly. No cameras, no press. Not in the presidential palace, but in a modest community center on the outskirts of the capital. The building was made of concrete and tin, but the walls were alive with color. Children's artwork, hand-painted murals about literacy and health. And there, without ceremony, President Traoré arrived, wearing the same simple, earth-tone jacket he had worn on air. But here, surrounded by his people, he seemed different, more grounded, more radiant. "Miss Monroe," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome to Burkina Faso." "Mr. President," she replied, her voice softer than usual, touched with nervousness. "I thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know I don't deserve your time." Traoré smiled, not as a politician but as a man who understood something larger. "We all deserve each other's time," he said. "That's what respect is. Recognizing that everyone has something to teach us." They sat in simple plastic chairs, beneath drawings of hope and resilience. It wasn't the CNN studio. It wasn't sleek or staged. But it was real. And sometimes real is where truth finally lives. "I came to apologize," Kaitlyn began. But President Traoré raised a calm, open hand. "You already have," he said softly. "What I'd like to know is, what did you learn?" It was a question that cut past appearances, past media damage control, straight to the heart. Kaitlyn had spent weeks preparing for this moment. She had read books on Burkina Faso's history, memorized its political structure, studied its traditions and cultures. But in that moment, she understood the truth. The real learning didn't come from research. It came from reckoning. "I learned," she said quietly, "that I became the kind of person I used to criticize." She looked down for a moment, struggling with the weight of it. Someone who judges others by the surface, who sees difference and assumes inferiority. "I learned that privilege doesn't always show up as arrogance. Sometimes it's silence, sometimes it's a laugh. And that laugh was cruelty I didn't recognize in myself until it was too late." Traoré nodded, not coldly, but thoughtfully. "And what will you do with that learning?" She hesitated, honest. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I know I can't go back. I can't pretend that moment didn't happen. It showed me something about myself I can't unsee." For nearly 2 hours, they talked. Not about politics, not about policy, but about something deeper. Language and identity, memory and belonging. About the weight of an accent. About what it means to be heard, not just listened to. He spoke of childhood classrooms where French was the only language allowed, of being told his native tongue was too emotional, of learning to survive in a world that only rewarded those who could mimic it. "My grandmother was a griot," he said, "a keeper of stories. She told me, 'The voice you are born with carries the voices of your ancestors. Do not trade it for the applause of strangers.'" Then he looked at Kaitlyn, gently, without accusation. "When you laughed at my accent," he said, "you weren't laughing at me. You were laughing at her voice. My grandmother, my father, my mother, everyone who ever taught me to speak with dignity." The weight of that truth settled over Kaitlyn like a wave. She hadn't just mocked a person. She had dismissed a lineage. "How do I make amends for that?" she asked, her voice cracking. "By remembering," he replied. by carrying this feeling forward, and by making sure no one else ever has to feel what I felt in that studio. When they finally stood to part, Kaitlyn didn't feel absolved. She felt awakened, not forgiven, but given a chance to choose a better version of herself. The documentary she later produced wasn't like her other work. It wasn't about ratings. It wasn't about drama. It was about recovery from ignorance, from pride, from the casual harm done in the name of professionalism. And the most powerful moment came at the very end. She stood quietly in a rural classroom in Burkina Faso, watching barefoot children recite poetry in their mother tongues. The teacher, a young woman named Fatima, approached her. "We saw the interview," she said, in careful, accented English. "We use it now to teach." Fatima explained that they had turned Troy's words into a lesson plan on respect, on self-worth, on the power of voice. "We tell the children, never be ashamed of how they speak." A little girl, no older than 8, raised her hand, and in that voice, soft, lilting, undeniably African, she recited, "The strongest winds do not come from polished mouths, but from honest lungs." The words echoed. Somehow they carried more weight spoken by her than they had in the CNN studio. They felt like prophecy. Months later, Kaitlyn returned to CNN. But she was different now. Gone was the primetime anchor who once dominated airtime with poise and polish. In her place stood a woman who had learned the value of silence, of listening, of humility. She became a voice for authenticity, for dignity, for stories that honor, not diminish. The interview with Ibrahim Traoré, barely 30 minutes long, became required viewing in journalism schools around the world. But not just there. In sociology courses, in international relations seminars, in classrooms from Boston to Bangalore. At Oxford, Professor Sarah Williams included it in her course on post-colonial media. What made this moment unforgettable, she told her students, wasn't the confrontation, it was the grace. Troy never shouted. He didn't accuse. He stood in his truth, and that truth resonated. Students across continents shared their own stories. The Indian girl mocked for her pronunciation of 3. The Nigerian boy whose ideas were ignored until someone else repeated them in an American accent. The Chinese student told she sounded cute when explaining quantum physics. They weren't just watching a clip, they were watching themselves. And in Burkina Faso, the legacy lived on. President Traoré's words were etched on school walls, quoted in political speeches, whispered by teachers, painted in murals. Dignity is not something you can lose, it's something you give away. I have spoken French to be accepted, English to be understood, but when I speak truth, it is my accent that offends. The strongest winds do not come from polished mouths, but from honest lungs. Years passed, but those winds, they never stopped blowing. The story spread like wildfire across TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. A global conversation had erupted, one that went far beyond the original interview. Hashtags like "My Accent, My Power" began trending as thousands of people filmed themselves speaking proudly in their native accents, refusing to let shame define their voices anymore. In the heart of this digital wave was a quiet revolution, one built not on protest marches or policy papers, but on something simpler, the reclaiming of voice. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, the reaction was just as profound, though shaped by different currents. On the international stage, the interview had done what years of diplomacy had failed to achieve. It elevated President Ibrahim Traoré's profile overnight. Suddenly, world leaders who once dismissed him as just another African populist were requesting meetings. The European Union, which had been drafting sanctions, now found itself in a PR nightmare, awkwardly trying to engage a leader who had just been mocked on global television, and who had responded with poise, dignity, and truth. But the real impact? It was at home. In cafes, barbershops, university halls, and roadside stalls across Ouagadougou, citizens gathered around phones and radios, watching the clip on loop. Here was their president, speaking not like a Western puppet, not like someone desperate to appease global powers, but as a son of the soil, proud and unapologetically authentic. He didn't mimic Western polish. He didn't soften his voice. He spoke their truth, and in their voice. Then another voice joined the conversation. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the renowned Nigerian author, penned an essay in The Atlantic titled "The Danger of a Single Sound." It exploded across the internet. In it, Adichie wrote, "When Kaitlyn Monroe laughed at President Traoré's accent, she wasn't just laughing at one man. She was laughing at millions of people who've been taught that their way of speaking English, the language forced upon them by colonization, is inherently inferior to the English of their colonizers." The essay struck a nerve. It was shared by scholars, artists, presidents, and students alike. It sparked heated debates across news channels, college campuses, and cultural festivals. Academic conferences suddenly had entire panels on linguistic bias and neo-colonial media framing. What had begun as a moment of live TV discomfort had become something seismic, a reckoning. Back in the U.S., CNN found itself under a firestorm. Thousands of complaints flooded the network. Advertisers pulled their sponsorships. Civil rights organizations called for accountability. Inside the newsroom, there were emergency meetings and long, uncomfortable silences. For Margaret Chen, CNN's president, it was the toughest challenge of her career. She faced an impossible task: protect the network's reputation, acknowledge the legitimate outrage, and confront the failure of one of their most respected anchors, all while holding on to their journalistic values. "This isn't just a crisis," Chen told her executive team. "This is a moral test. It's about what we stand for and whether our storytellers actually honor the people they cover." Kaitlyn Monroe's decision to take a leave of absence and travel to Burkina Faso was met with skepticism from some in the network. Was it sincere, or just a PR stunt? But once the cameras started rolling in West Africa, it became clear. This wasn't damage control. It was transformation. The documentary titled Voices of Dignity was unlike anything CNN had ever aired. It didn't follow the usual format of talking heads and expert panels. Instead, it was deeply personal, raw, and intimate. It followed Kaitlyn on a journey, not just through Burkina Faso, but into herself. She met with students, farmers, elders, and market women. They told their stories of being mocked for their accents in school, of struggling to be understood abroad, of learning to love the sound of their own voices again. One of the most moving scenes took place in a rural classroom. A teacher named Aminata had rewritten her curriculum after the Traoré interview. She now taught her students not only grammar and vocabulary, but pride in their own speech. When they speak English with a Burkinabe accent, they're not speaking incorrectly. They're speaking with the music of their ancestors. The children, some as young as 6, stood up and with proud voices recited Traoré's words. "The strongest winds do not come from polished mouths, but from honest lungs." Their pronunciation wasn't perfect, but their message was. Kaitlyn, watching from the back of the room, had tears in her eyes. The documentary also turned the camera inward. In candid interviews, Kaitlyn spoke about her own family, Irish immigrants who had been ridiculed for their accents, who taught their children to fit in by speaking proper American English. "I realized," she said in one scene, "that I had inherited the shame my grandparents were made to feel and passed it on. not in words, but in behavior, in laughter, in dismissal. The documentary aired to wide acclaim. Critics praised its honesty. Activists saw it as a rare example of media reckoning done right. And across the diaspora, families watched together, some crying, others smiling, as their voices were finally validated on global television. Back at CNN headquarters, something shifted. Journalists began questioning how they approached interviews. Newsrooms around the world started training sessions on accent bias and cultural humility. A global conversation that began with mockery had evolved into something redemptive. And in Burkina Faso, the moment became legend. President Traoré's words were painted on school walls and recited at youth festivals. His quiet strength, his refusal to be diminished, became a symbol of what it means to lead with dignity. His voice, imperfect, accented, steady, echoed across borders, and long after the headlines faded, it remained a reminder. The strongest winds do not come from polished mouths, they come from honest lungs. The documentary's most intimate moment came during an extended interview with President Ibrahim Traoré, not in a presidential palace or press room, but under the sprawling baobab tree where he had grown up, the same tree where his grandmother once told stories late into the night. Dressed simply, seated on a wooden bench, Traoré spoke softly but with conviction. "When I speak with my accent," he said, "I carry the voices of my ancestors. I honor the griots who preserved our history, the teachers who taught me to dream, the farmers who fed me. My accent is not a flaw to be corrected, it's a gift to be shared." The line, like so many before it, resonated deeply. When the film premiered on CNN, it drew massive global viewership. Critics praised its depth, humility, and emotional honesty. It went on to win multiple journalism awards and was translated into over 30 languages. But beyond the accolades, it did something far more meaningful. It sparked a global conversation about voice, bias, and dignity. At CNN, the documentary marked a turning point. The network launched sweeping reforms, mandatory bias training for all on-air staff, new editorial guidelines around accent sensitivity, and the creation of a new leadership position, Director of Global Voice. The role was charged with ensuring that international guests were treated with cultural respect, not just on camera, but in every step of their media engagement. The ripple effect was swift. Competing networks followed suit, reviewing their own practices and launching similar initiatives. Journalism schools updated syllabi to include new courses on cultural literacy and unconscious bias in reporting. Universities began using the Traoré interview as a case study not only in journalism, but in sociology, linguistics, and international relations. In his best-selling book, The Sound of Power: How Accent Shapes Perception, linguist Dr. James Patterson devoted an entire chapter to Traoré's response. President Traoré did not just withstand linguistic prejudice, he redefined the moment. He didn't defend his accent, he redefined it as a symbol of integrity. He didn't apologize for how he sounded, he forced the world to examine how it listens. The book became essential reading, and Patterson was invited to speak at global summits on language, perception, and power. Back in Burkina Faso, the impact was no less transformative. The nation's tourism industry, once hampered by regional instability, saw a spike in interest. Visitors, particularly from the African diaspora, arrived eager to learn, to connect, to witness the place that had birthed a moment of global awakening. A delegation of African American travelers, inspired by the interview, came to experience the culture firsthand. They returned as vocal advocates for stronger ties between Africa and the diaspora. Even the economy felt the effects. Foreign investors who once overlooked Burkina Faso now saw a leader capable of commanding respect on the global stage. Troy's steady hand and principled response to global scrutiny made the country appear not just resilient, but promising. But perhaps the most profound legacy was found in the hearts of young Africans and their peers across the diaspora. A generation that had long been taught to speak properly or neutralize their accent now had a new standard: speak authentically. Speak proudly. One of those voices belonged to Aisha Dio, a 19-year-old student at the University of Ghana. Before the interview, she'd practiced softening her voice to sound more global. But after watching Troy, everything changed. She said, "I realized I didn't need to change my voice to be heard. I needed to own my voice to be respected." She launched a campus series where African students shared their stories in their native dialects and accents. The movement spread to universities across the continent and into the diaspora, forming a grassroots network of authentic voice advocates. Art responded too. Musicians sampled Troy's speeches and Afrobeat anthems. Painters captured scenes from the interview in bold murals. Spoken word artists wove his words into their performances, celebrating linguistic identity and cultural pride. In the U.S., educators took notice. At a Los Angeles high school where immigrant students had long been teased for their accents, teacher Maria Gonzalez introduced the Troy interview into her curriculum. She said the change was immediate. "When my students saw a president proudly speaking in an accent like theirs and being respected for it, they sat up straighter. Their shame turned into pride." Inspired, her class launched a school-wide project documenting the rich linguistic diversity among students. That project eventually expanded district-wide and was adopted in multiple schools as a model for inclusive education. 2 years later, in a packed auditorium at Columbia University, Kaitlyn Monroe and Ibrahim Traoré met again, this time not as interviewer and guest, but as collaborators. The event, titled Voices of Dignity: Media Responsibility in a Global Age, brought together journalists, scholars, and students from around the world. Their conversation was warm, reflective, marked by growth, not tension. "I'm grateful for what happened, not because it was easy, but because it sparked the conversations we needed to have," Troy said. Kaitlyn, now far from the polished anchor she once was, nodded in agreement. "That moment under the lights changed me, but it also showed the world something bigger. That respect is not a performance, it's a commitment." The Troy interview had lasted only 30 minutes, but its echoes, its truths, its call for grace continue to be felt across continents, institutions, and generations. In schools, in studios, and in the quiet, confident voices of children once told to speak differently, because now the world understands what it once overlooked. The strongest winds do not come from polished mouths, but from honest lungs. I've come to understand that journalism isn't just about asking the right questions. It's about making space for real voices to be heard. President Troy taught me something I'll never forget. Respect isn't something we give, it's something we recognize. The auditorium was silent for a moment after Kaitlyn Monroe spoke those words. Hundreds of journalism students sitting in still reflection. Many left the conference with more than inspiration. They left with a new sense of responsibility, a deeper understanding of what it means to be stewards of truth, not just reporters of it. The event was live-streamed and watched by thousands around the world. It reignited a global conversation about media ethics, representation, and the quiet power of dignity. And in the years that followed, the interview between Kaitlyn Monroe and Ibrahim Traoré didn't fade, It became a cornerstone of how we talk about voice, bias, and respect. It was studied in universities, quoted in classrooms, referenced in political debates, and featured in research journals. But its legacy wasn't about the attention it got. Its real power lay in something simpler and more profound. It reminded people everywhere that dignity is not negotiable, that respect is not a favor to be offered, it's a birthright. It reminded us that the strongest voices are often the ones the world has tried hardest to silence. What began as a tense moment in a TV studio became something much more, a global turning point, a lesson in humility, a quiet revolution in how we listen and who we choose to hear. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and Kaitlyn Monroe was no longer just a viral clip or a headline. It became a mirror held up to a world too quick to judge, too slow to understand. Because in the end, healing begins with listening, deeply, humbly, to voices that don't sound like ours, but carry truths we all need. Now we'd like to hear from you. What would you have done in Troy's position? Do you believe grace is more powerful than confrontation? Have you ever been judged for how you speak or silenced for how you sound? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell your story, because your voice matters. Like this video if you believe authenticity deserves respect. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us the strongest wins do not come from polished mouths, but from honest lungs.